Thank you. I'm going to follow up where Ed left off, and I want to start by saying that if you look at what heterodox economics is broadly conceived, it's largely seems to be defined, at least in terms of departures from some aspect of orthodox economics. So there are core assumptions in orthodox economics, and there are departures. Core assumption, selfish behavior. Departure, social behavior. Core assumption, optimal outcomes, non-optimal outcomes. Perfect knowledge, imperfect and asymmetric knowledge. Rational choice, bounded rationality. Perfect competition, imperfect competition. Rational expectations, adaptive explanations, non-ergodic futures. Passive interactions, strategic interactions, game theory. Automatic full employment, possible unemployment. All outcomes internal to the market. Some outcomes may involve externalities. The function of the state, the ideal function state in the core assumptions to protect property rights in free markets. So in terms of the departure, the state can be viewed as also needing to regulate market outcomes, giving the list of all the other departures. What is interesting is that many of these departures are also part of orthodox economics because they're viewed as extensions of the basic theory. So the core assumptions found define the basic theory, and then the departures allow you in every textbook to have a chapter or two on those. So Becker's theory of the household allows for some social behavior. Herbert Simon's focus on bounded rationality relaxes the sort of assumptions of rational choice and perfect knowledge. Stiglitz focuses on asymmetric knowledge, especially in the financial institutions. Krugman focuses on the implications of economies of scale and heterogeneity of preferences in theory of international trade. Behavioral economics in general focuses on departures from the notion of rational economic man. And game theory focuses on small-scale and perhaps larger-scale strategic interactions. What is most striking about this core departure set is that these departures, viewed as extensions, cannot be added up into a general theory. There is no general theory of departures. The departures have to start from the core theory, and they all consist of modifications that are local to that set of assumptions. So you take a proper textbook in Orthodox economics today, and for every description of one of the core things, there'll be a departure. But when you get to the end of the textbook, you still have the core theory, because the departures are seen sotto voce as just a little bit of extension. So the effect of this is that the core theory remains central to the discourse. It remains, in a sense, the point of departure. And because of that, it retains its hegemony. And for that reason, I would argue that heterodox economics should not operate in this manner, because it, in effect, keeps the Pope in place, but it has some doubts about some priests. And I think that's not a good way to have an alternative. Perhaps I'm speaking here as a Muslim, but that's another story. So what then should define heterodox economics? I think it is that it should be grounded in a different theoretical foundation. Now, of course, you'll come back to the same issues, and you may come back with the understanding that markets are not optimal, they're not efficient, and all that, but they shouldn't be done by means of starting from the general theory of orthodox economics and then kind of moving away a little bit at a time. And here, there are really only two basic options in terms of general theories, though there are many other specific subsets. First one, of course, is Keynesian and Kaleckian theory. What is important about it is that it's constructed differently from neoclassical theory. It is not to be derived by putting imperfections in neoclassical theory. It's really a different theory. And Keynes particularly saw himself clearly as creating a different foundation for economics, not merely a modification of standard theory. He saw himself as overthrowing the standard theory and creating something else. And that's why he called it the general theory. The key point in Keynes's argument is that aggregate demand is the ultimate limit to production and employment. Unemployment can be a normal state of affairs in a capitalist economy. Keynesian theory, and Keynes himself particularly, were strongly pro-capitalist, and that's an important feature of Keynesian theory because it makes it much more acceptable to the orthodoxy as it's looking for places that it's going to go. The market will be, and the state together will achieve the promise that the orthodoxy offers in terms of the state, which is full employment growth and price stability. And that was a motivating force for the early Keynesians, and I still think it is today. From this comes the fundamental role of the state as regulator of the market, the state as a potentially neutral referee, and obviously these differences have general implications for policy. And I would say that Keynesian theory is the dominant point of view of the heterodox tradition. But there is another set of theories, which are in a sense older than Keynesian theories, and I want to call them here classical political economy, the theories of Smith, Ricardo, and especially of Marx, which are also different, but they're different from Keynesian theory. Capital, labor are not viewed as equal. Class is a fundamental social relation. Race, gender, and ethnicity are bound in the matrix of class relations, and that's a very important point. They're not separate. They're bound in that matrix. The emphasis in this framework is on the turbulent patterns of market forces. Markets don't achieve equilibrium. They achieve a rough balance by overshooting and undershooting, and the disorder is the means to the order. They're not separable. The emphasis on this in this tradition is on competition as the root of the powerful gravitational forces of political economy. The dominant incentive in this is the profit motive. It dominates all others because it's central to the operation of capital and hence of the business sector. The system is viewed as inherently expansionary, which is located in the premise of capital, which is to put money in to get more money out. And of course, if you get more money out, you need to put more in to get more out. And that expansionary character shows up in its geographical expansion, as well as an expansion to new arenas all the time. So it's not just globalization, but all other areas of life that capital expands to. Mechanization and industrialization are intrinsic features of this point of view. And unemployment, if you follow especially the argument in Marx, is a necessary outcome. It's not an option, it's not a possibility, it's necessary. The system has mechanisms to create it. And this is, of course, created on a global scale, not national scale, because the markets operate on a global scale. So you cannot speak about national employment as if it's unrelated to unemployment in Egypt or unemployment in Italy or Spain or whatever, Latin America. Now, the last point is that the state, from this point of view, it can be a potential regulator, but is subject to strict limits. And these limits are of two sorts. One is a political limit, a limit which, say, the Marxist tradition, which borrows the Keynesian argument, often emphasizes, Sweezy and Magdoff, and going back to Lenin as opposed to Hilferding. And the other is a profit limit, because the state cannot go very far in impinging upon the profit motive. So that brings me, I'm clearly in this tradition. I've been watching too many commercials, political commercials, so I feel strongly inclined to say that I'm Anwar Sheikh and I approve of this message. So is space opening up for heterodox economics? I think the immediate reaction to the crisis and to the clear bias that the state has exhibited everywhere, absolutely everywhere, except for some Latin American countries, has been a local and political revolt. And it's growing, and it'll continue to grow because I think things are not going to get better in any near future. But there's also a reaction within the dominant capitalist institutions themselves that market fundamentalism, which these institutions have been enforcing on the rest of the world and on the center countries too, is flawed. Dominique Strauss-Kahn at the first INET conference, which was in Cambridge, said, "We have been misled by the standard models." Now, this is really the heart of the orthodoxy speaking. And so there is space for departures from orthodoxy. And even in political circles, in official circles, a comeback of Keynesian economics. Because in practice, the state has had to return to Keynesian economics and has seen in practice what happens when you do austerity and you get things worse. But in the universities across the world, most economic departments are still under the control of the ayatollahs of economics. And that's just a fact that at the same time, the wall that these people and these schools of thought have erected is cracking. It's cracking less in the United States than it is in Europe, and it's more in Latin America than it is in Europe. So where would one look? I would say that one would look in Latin America rather than Europe, but I would look in Europe rather than the United States, because the US is actually a lagging indicator of this opening space. The space is there, and it will open, I hope, though there's no guarantee of that, but I can say that this is a hopeful time for all of us who have been long arguing against the orthodoxy and emphasizing its significant and grave deficiencies. Thank you. Thank you. I think we all agree on certain basic propositions. One is that however we define ourselves, we insist upon stepping outside the limits of conventional economics, the ruling economics of the day, which is not necessarily the economics that used to rule with Keynesian economics, nor perhaps economics that will come to rule. And I think we all agree that reality should be the central object of investigation. That is to say, instead of just spending all our time thinking about what Keynes might have said or thought, or Marx, or should have said, or for that matter, what Samuelson or Solow should have said, I think we understand that we have to talk about reality as a central object of investigation. But then two questions arise. How do you approach the object of investigation, which is reality? If you were a physicist or biologist, can you imagine that you would go there without having read Newton or Darwin or Einstein or Dirac? It is unimaginable, and it should be unimaginable, because it would be a terrible mistake. You would be reinventing something, which you're unlikely to invent, by the way, that well. And that then brings up the related issue. Why not just say that, look, unlike Einstein and Dirac and Newton and Darwin, we have a social goal. Let's go for that goal, and we use the tools that we can that be persuasive. Persuasive, of course, to the other side, because we don't have the power, the people in power. But then you run into a problem. Robert Solow is just as progressive in that dimension. He doesn't like inequality. He doesn't want stagnation. He wants... So what's the difference between him and us in terms of that? So then the next step is, why not take Robert Solow's model and add class to the Solow growth model, or add expectations to the Solow growth model? Because then you'll be persuasive. He'll certainly be very impressed by this. And you might persuade people in Congress, but I would argue that because then you remain trapped in a model which is fundamentally wrong. And if the goal that you have is to sort of marginally move away from these models by adding accretions to them, this is what I meant by departures, you remain trapped in that church. And I think that the situation in the world is such that we need to step outside. I don't necessarily disagree with Sanjay's idea of the speculative leap, but I don't mean by the speculative leap that we have to reinvent the alternative, because it's been around for a long time and it's been suppressed. And we need to give room for different points of view to compete about explaining the world, of going beneath the surface and showing structures that are there and saying, look, understanding these structures, certain outcomes are possible and other outcomes are not. And we have to be bold enough, in my opinion, to say that, not flinch from it. Thanks.
So we'd like to open the floor for questions. If you would, state your name and your affiliation, and please wait for Mary to hand you the microphone before you begin to speak.
Hi, I'm Eloy. I'm a student here. Professor Nell actually mentioned Samuelson's foundations in his first speech, and I think that captured the imagination of a group of economists in the 1950s and in the late 1940s. But I think the book of Samuelson that actually did put basically had the most influence was his textbook. And my question is about why there has not been an equal pedagogical push from in the textbook arena from the various schools of thought in heterodoxy. And I know it's very hard for people to basically corner heterodoxy into one single realm of thought, but still, I think there's been a lot of right now, if there's not a good undergraduate textbook, and I think most of us have taught a few courses know that, actually it's very hard for us to basically just speak from a critique based on a book that is uncritical of what's happening out there. So I just wanted to hear your points about that, and if you see if there is any progress on that. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions and then have the panel answer.
Hi, Fernando, who's here also. I just want to touch on an issue that I think was somewhat implicit in most of the remarks, and I would be very glad if it was taken to the surface, which is the epistemological dimension of our position, of our challenge to the mainstream, or whatever we're trying to do here. A lot of remarks kind of suggested epistemological dualism, in the sense that social sciences are inherently different from natural sciences. And my question is how each of you personally understand this issue, whether what we try to do in replacing the mainstream or whatever we're trying to do is just to make a better, more realistic or better predictive science in the sense of that science is understood by the mainstream economists, whether a position that is more closely possibly to what Christian said, whether we're just instrumentalists, very skeptical about the possibilities of social science, and we just have a political agenda that we're trying to make successful through some pseudo-theoretical models, whether recuperating Marx's sense of critique might lead us somewhat to a different path in which positive and normative dimensions should be combined to do social sciences in a more meaningful way, which could possibly lead to more directly and naturally to the big questions of in which society we want to live, whether differently from how we can better manage society in relation to the bourgeois economies, or to a kind of more creative institutionalism that Sanjay is pointing to. So that's like the epistemological dimension is what I'm interested in.
Hello, Johan, also in this department. I was going to ask a similar question that Fernando just raised, but since that is on the table, I'd really like to hear more from faculty about their personal views about, well, the role of the intellectual in academia, if you want, the role of the heterodox economists in academia. Teresa and Sanjay touched on this a little bit, and we appreciate that. Christian made a statement about this at the end, which, I don't know, some people might disagree with or agree with. I'd really like to hear about your views on, well, the role of the heterodox or other identified economist in academia. What is it about? What is it for? What are the constraints?
Sorry. I think really all three questions are closely related, and so let me just start with Johan's. And I think the role of intellectual in academia is to try to understand the world, and particularly the object of our particular investigations with economics. We're not doing everything, and that if we're going to be economists, we have to present and try to develop an understanding of the world, and that means developing knowledge by studying not only the world, but other people who have something important to say about it. And that's not different, I think, than any intellectual. But the second one is to change this world. That is to apply this knowledge. And that means not only policy, but analysis. You change the world also by understanding it and passing that understanding to people who might be able to apply it in concrete ways. And I think analysis and policy includes demonstrations in the streets against central banks and all of that, if people have an understanding of why that's wrong. And third part is to pass this knowledge on to education. A very important function that we all obviously are committed to. Keep in mind that I don't think there's a difference. We have different experiences in policy. I, for instance, have worked at the Levy Institute as a macro modeler for policy for 5 or 6 years. And I did that precisely because I wanted to learn how this is done, and I want to be able to do it with the best, which was, of course, Win Godley. So I have a great respect for policy and a great interest in it, but I insist that in order to approach that question, you have to have some place to stand, and that place should be distinct. That's my personal view. Other people don't necessarily share that. But that raises the question about textbook. If you can produce a textbook which is a series of extensions of orthodox economics, and there are such textbooks. There are progressive writers who can say, well, there's a solo growth model, then you add this to it, and it doesn't work that quite way, then you move on to a different issue. I think in order to have a textbook, you should have a unified foundation in the same way that neoclassical does, and that Keynes tried to do. And it's, again, my personal preference, that you have to begin from that foundation, but you have to answer the same questions. You cannot just choose your question in a textbook. You can do it in your personal work. So you have to answer microeconomics and demand curves and exchange rates and interest rates and relative prices and growth and inequality in a unified way. And that can only happen through a collective effort. Keynes was synthesizing ideas that he developed, but of course he had the best people in the world working with him to push these ideas and apply them. And neoclassical economists have thousands, if not tens of thousands of people extending this. If we're going to do the same, we have to have some agreement about some framework, and we have to proceed on that. And as you know, that's a very hard thing to achieve when nobody wants to talk about it and nobody wants to fund it, and you cannot get people who have the time. Our students should be fully funded so they can work on this rather than having to do other things. We're not able to achieve that. So but I think it will happen. Absolutely will happen. It's just taking more time because there are so few of us and our resources are so limited.
We're going to open the floor for just a few more questions because we're going to have to wrap up.
Lucy Webster. I'm a MA graduate here from about 5 years ago. I'd like to ask a question that relates to public policy. I'm concerned with the evidence that a lot of people on the right in the Republican Party are encumbered with ideas that do not match at all my ideas of reality in terms of, the slogan that you can't take tax money from the very rich because they're the job creators is, in my view, countered quite nicely by a slogan from the Democrats that the job creators are the people who buy things and create demand. So this very simple idea that you need demand, aggregate demand to get an economy going is not perceived hardly at all on the far right. And these people are therefore playing into the hands of people. They're working against their own interests. And I would like the panel to comment on what economists should be doing to try to rectify this lack of basic education.
Pedro, I'm a student here, and well, I think the answer to my question was partially answered by some of you in intervention, but I want to put it in a more specific form, and that is that in academia, at least, we face certain constraints, and that is, for instance, we have an incentive to publish a lot, and that incentive seems to create a pervasive effect in the sense that the idea of critical thinking seems to be pushed aside because you want to publish a lot and probably you just change a model a little bit here, or you, instead of applying it to the United States, you apply it to China, and then you have an additional article with you. So given your experience, I'm wondering, besides courage, what other alternatives do we have? And if you think that this is changing in the future, at least in the long term.
Hi, my name is Luis. Is working? Yeah, I have one question. I think I want to understand more about the differences between the methodology between mainstream economics and heterodox economics. Professor Sheikh mentioned in his intervention that usually we see heterodox economics as departures from mainstream economics assumptions, but I think there might be some other deep differences between these two approaches. I just would like to learn more about this.
And Christian?
Hi, my name is Christian. I'm a PhD student here. I have a more specific question on a topic which I think is one of the major shortcomings of heterodox macro models, which is the response to the Lucas critique. I think the Lucas critique, which is the critique that the policy implications or the policy implementation derived from a structural model affects the very parameters of the structural model, is, in my view, a valid critique. I just think that the response of the mainstream, just assuming rational expectations and building microforms and macro models, is not a useful response to this critique. But I also see that mainstream heterodox macro models don't really have to say a lot about the Lucas critique and don't have, in my view, so far a satisfying response to this critique. I think the major response is just ignoring this critique and building still the same structuralist macro models. So I would be interested in your views on the significance of the Lucas critique and how you would think that macro models should implement that or take that into account.
We're going to run over time a little bit, but I think these questions are important, so we'll just pose them to the panel.
A historical note. Heinz Kurtz at a conference in Graz mentioned that Sraffa was offered a job at the new school. I just saw that they found it in Sraffa's archives, and he turned it down. Now, in the old new school, he probably would have gotten tenure, but the new school, he would definitely have not gotten tenure. Because he wouldn't have fit the conventional mode of proceeding as an academic, churning out papers and doing the right kinds of things. And as you know, I teach a seminar on Sraffa for the last 15 years, so I hold him in the highest regard, and even though he could not have gotten tenure at the new school. On Lucy's question, why right-wing politicians mistakenly supporting wrong policies? I think the point, Lucy, is that they're not mistaken. I think they're right. They're right because the policies are right for some people. The policies that are wrong for most of us are right for some people, and that's a point that Sanjay made about interests. Their interests, the interests they speak to, the Koch brothers are absolutely happy with those policies. They know what's going to happen.
Ordinary people vote for it.
That's a different issue. But why they? Yeah, that's right. That's outside of economics.
Professional division.
That's right. And well, in fact, that brings us to the next point, which is this notion of the Lucas critique and the idea of rational expectations. Now, to me, it should be clear that there is an answer to the idea that people's expectations affect outcomes, and outcomes affect expectations in turn, and that's very old. As Christian pointed out, is built into Keynesian theory from the start. It's not going to be modeled as rational expectations, but it's built into all economic theory. Marx begins by saying the difference between a spider and a human is that a human architect conceives of the object before he builds it, and a spider does not. But it's the expectation that distinguishes, not the beauty of the cathedral. And that's a very important thing to understand. So they're absolutely there. But it doesn't follow that they can be modeled in this absurd way. Someone who cares about this is George Soros, who has a whole approach to the notion of reflexivity. And the idea is that expectations affect actual outcomes, and actual outcomes affect fundamentals, and then they feed back, and expectations, because they affect actual outcomes, can create bubbles, but the distance between where you are and the fundamental begins to have a telling effect on expectations, and you come back. I've always argued, I've seen in courses, as you know, that's the Roadrunner example. Coyote runs off the edge of the table and keeps running in the air, and he's perfectly fine until Roadrunner whistles and says, "Look down." And at that moment, he falls to the ground like a stone. So we're living in this moment where the Roadrunner looked down. And it has nothing to do with rational expectations. It's about how people behave and how feedback comes, and we can certainly model that. By the way, there is no such thing as a single individual. In Roadrunner, there's one Roadrunner, but we're all Roadrunners. And we have different beliefs about whether we are off the cliff or not. We have different understandings of what to go, and how far we can go. For every market where there are longs, people who believe the market's going to go up, there are shorts, people who's going to go down. And the shorts and longs disagree with each other. So we're really going to talk about this. We have to understand how heterogeneous people with different expectations about an indeterminate future interact. And of all the answers to that, the worst possible answer is irrational expectations, in my opinion. So I would say that any model built on rational expectations is wrong from the start, whether or not it mimics some empirical process. It's methodologically wrong. And so the last point is that it's not a question of tools. It's all of us here use tools. We use econometrics, we use nonlinear dynamics, we use econophysics, we use agent-based simulation because we think those are useful. As you know, those of you who work with us, we encourage you to work in that direction. Speaking for myself, what is important to me is the context in which the tool is used. I am not impressed by tools in themselves. They have the ability to answer some questions, but they do not generate the questions, and they do not give you in themselves an interpretation of their result. That has to come from the outside. That's why you need a better vision, a better understanding of economics. That's why we teach what Halbrunner long ago taught us, which is there's more than one point of view, and in my opinion they were generally better in the old days than they are now.